Okay, welcome. So this discussion is about the overall conclusion about race and biology. So we started by thinking about three types of views about race. This is sort of one way to set up the debate. You could think that race is a biological category. Human races are natural kinds. This might be called biological realism or something like that. But another view is that you could say, well, race is meant to be a biological category, but actually there aren't different natural kinds of people in the right way. Now, what way that is might be open, but the idea is that, in fact, races do not exist. There are no such thing as races. A third view is that, well, human races do exist. They are objectively real, but they're not natural kinds. There are no natural divisions of people, but there are some kind of social kinds. Just as we divide up people, into married and not married or different religions, that's real, but there's no biological underpinning for it. Okay, so those are three types of views. And just to sort of remind you what we read a piece by Anthony Appiah called "Why There Are No Human Races." So, and there we read along with the French naturalist Bernier and the American Anthropological Association statement on race. That's to help us understand the history, because Appiah relies on history. We read Charles Mills, But What Are You Really? The Metaphysics of Race. And then we read Cavalli Sforza, a short Scientific American piece, Genes, Language, and Peoples, and Robin Andreasen, a philosopher who uses Cavalli Sforza to defend what she calls a cladistic view of race. And then finally, we read Joshua Glasgow, who criticizes Andreasen and all other modern biological views of race. So I'll just kind of quickly talk about those first two to remind you what they're at. I made slides on Appiah and Mills already, but just as a reminder, Appiah's conclusion is that there are no biological races. He comes to that conclusion because he thinks the history of racial terms shows us that what we're talking about when we talk about race are essential biological divisions. That is, members of different races have essential differences. They're different kinds of people, but now we know there are no such divisions, so there's no races. Charles Mills thinks that race is real. As he says, it's a deep reality. Now, it's not biologically real, so he agrees with Appiah there, but he just thinks it's socially constructed. He says it's contingently deep reality that structures our particular social universe, having a social objectivity and causal significance that arise out of our particular history. So races might be different at different times or in different countries, but it is a fact that some people are, for example, the same race as each other or different races. Okay, so that was the backdrop for last week. Now, what we're doing this week is we're looking at what you might call the new biology of race, new biological studies that some people take to confirm the reality of race. Okay, so we read Robin Andreasen, who argues, she starts from this presumption that if races do exist, if it's a biological grouping, then it's really synonymous with subspecies. It's just any natural division below the species level. Now, in the literature, there's a problem with subspecies. People have tried various kinds of typological concepts. So there's different types. They might have essential traits. It turns out that is not really well supported. It doesn't make sense. She also mentions briefly just a kind of pure geographic conception. Neither one really works. On the other hand, there is a real way to talk about subspecies, at least a non-human species, and when it works, and that is a kind of evolutionary conception. The same way that we classify above the species level, namely on the basis of monophyly, what she calls the research program of cladism. And so the idea is that if human history has the right kind of tree structure, if there are monophyletic groups of populations, well, then there's human races. They're just the clades. Now, she has a particular tree. It's just an example, but it was a going tree when she wrote the paper. This is from Cavalli Sforza. Actually, she takes it from a large book that he has with some co-authors, mapping human history or human genes, or something of that nature. I assigned a short Scientific American piece called Genes, Peoples, and Languages, I believe. And Cavalli-Sforza's idea is just that actually, if you look at basic genetic distance, you can group people and form this tree, and you can sort of correct it and help understand it on the basis of paleontological and linguistic evidence about human migrations across the planet. So the way to read this, for example, is that the outgroup Africans, so the rest of the people on Earth came out of Africa. And so then the first split is between the New Guinea, Australian, Pacific Islander, Southeast Asian group, which split off from the other group, which then later became Northeast Asian, Arctic, Northeast Asian, American Indian, and European. There was of course, there's further splits along the way. This is if you just pick these 9 particular groups. Okay, so what's the cladistic view of race? The cladistic view of taxonomy in general says that only clades or monophyletic groups can be taxa, some ancestor and all of its descendants. So mammals are just some ancestral population and then all of their descendants. What you can't do is group together, for example, mammals and birds. You can't do that because there are some reptiles, which is, by the way, itself not a monophyletic group. But there are groups like lizards, which are more closely related to birds than to mammals. So you can't put the mammals and birds together. But you could add extra criteria, like if you're looking for species or for higher taxa, you might think not only do they have to be clades, but they have to be united in some important way, or maybe have some diagnostic traits. But Andreasen doesn't add any other criteria. She just says, look, any and all clades, they could be races. So for example, there could be 2 races. Now, if there's 2, it's going to be African, non-African, because that's the split. That is assuming her tree is correct. If there's 3, you could have African and then the South Pacific, that is Pacific Islander, Southeast Asian, Australian, and then another one, Europe and North and Central and South Asia. But you could have 4 races. You could have African, and then now if you have 4, you have lots of choices. You could have 5, you could have 6, etc. And of course, the tree she used is, in a sense, an arbitrary tree. What she really wants to do is classify by the history, whatever it is. Now, it's important to understand that means that there are no answers to questions like how many races are there. It depends on how fine-grained a distinction you want to make. If you want to be talking about these really fine-grained groups, then there could be a lot. If you want to be really coarse, there could be 2 or 3. That implies that, for example, there's no answer to the question, is X the same race as Y? If I pick 2 people or 2 populations and say, are they the same race? There's no, cladism doesn't give an answer there. Now, it does give some answers, and that's enough, as we'll see, for some people to criticize it already. But so, for example, it does say that if you have 2 things that are the same race, well then, they've got to be in the same clade. So you might have some Z as well. So for example, if American Indians and the Arctic North Asians, the Inuit peoples, if you count them as the same race, you can do that. But then you have to have the Northeast Asians. So for example, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, they would have to be the same race too. Why? Because the Arctic North Asians are actually more closely related to the Northeast Asians than they are to the American Indians. Okay. But now that's just one tree she uses. In fact, there's tons of other published trees, lots that just use more groups, of course, but also which change the branching order. So and I think that's important. So for example, here, this is just a paper I pulled off the internet from 2019 toward a global phylogeny of human populations. I think one of the most important and interesting features of a lot of these trees is that African, for example, is not a clade. And this is, in fact, based on just basic biological systematics principles, this is what you would expect. If there were already groups of African populations, and then there was a migration out of Africa, well, the migrants and their descendants are going to be more closely related to some African groups than to others. So for example, some of these, what are called the Afro-Asiatic groups, they're still in Africa, but they're actually more closely related to non-Africans than they are to some Africans. That's not surprising. In fact, Sarah Tishkoff has several, and her lab has several papers about just diversity within Africa, which they claim is far greater than the diversity basically in the rest of the world. This is how they build their particular tree. So it's still a tree structure, but for example, African would not be a clade. Some African groups, like Northeast Africans, are closer to some non-Africans than to some other African groups. So if this is the true tree, on the cladistic view of race, African is not a race. On the other hand, there could be races like this. Northeast African together with all non-Africans. That's one race. And then there could be 17 African races. So that level of grain is open on the cladistic view. What you can't do, if this is the correct tree, what you can't do is say African is one race, because after all, that's not a clade. Okay, so this, I think, leads pretty naturally into Joshua Glasgow's criticism. His main criticism of Andreasen is that even if you do this interbreeding thing, and even if you get some tree, I mean, one kind of criticism is that what if there just are no biological distinctions? What if human history is just too much interbreeding and migration? Well, that's one possible scientific criticism, but he doesn't go that route. Instead, he says, even if you do that, and even if you get a tree, they're too far apart from our common sense conventional groupings. It's not a concept of race. It's something else, breeding groups or something. Maybe they're interesting biological groups, but they aren't a biological underpinning for race. And part of the way he argues for that is by saying things like people in the United States would group, for example, all Africans together. And if they don't, then that just shows this is not a racial concept. Okay. It's also important to recognize that this is not the same as genetic similarity. So, for example, there's lots of just biological reasons that ancestry can come apart from similarity. Just a simple example, here's a tree, and what I have here is that there's some ancestral split, and then a new, more recent split between C and B, but C is, I sort of drew it sideways there, indicating that it's changed a lot, genetic distance-wise. So B is more closely related genealogically to C, but genetic similarity-wise, it's still similar to A. This is extremely common. People make mistakes in classifying organisms all the time because they look at, some groups of plants and say, oh, these things are pretty similar, but it turns out they just haven't changed a lot. They're very distantly related. This is to be expected on the cladistic level of grouping. But what you could do is instead say, oh, well, then let's not do cladistics. Let's instead just group by genetic similarity. Let's try to find clusters of people who are genetically the most similar. They're not necessarily going to be clades. In fact, almost certainly they will not be. Okay, what do you do if you do that? Well, here's a famous study published in Science in 2002. There's been a number of follow-up studies since. This one is just in your extra readings, and it's referenced in Glasgow. That's why I put it up there. Okay, how to look at this picture. So there's a program created by Noah Rosenberg and his colleagues called Structure. Or maybe not created by him. I can't remember, I'm sorry. But he was one of the early adopters using it. And what you can do is you can take a bunch of genomic data. So they look at the 1,096 individuals from the Human Genome Project, from the cell lines, and they're going to try to cluster them. If you tell your computer, I want to find two groups. So I want the people in one group to be similar to each other and the people in another group to be similar to each other. You forcibly put them into two groups. You do this anonymous and blind. You don't pre-label which individual is which. So the names on the top are what continents, roughly, what area of the world they're from. On the bottom is the particular ethnic group. And what do you get if you do two? If you do two, they label them purple and brown. Then it turns out that roughly the groups you get are going to be Africa, Europe, Middle East, and Central and South Asia. That's one group. and East Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. That's the second group. Now, the vertical lines here are individual people, and so when it's mixed, like if it's mixed purple and brown, what that means is there's a sense in which they, this is a probabilistic grouping. So you can say things like, well, 80% of this person's genes cluster with the African group and 20% with the East Asian group. So that can happen. And in fact, it does happen in populations that are effectively mixed. But what if you tell the computer to make 3 groups? If you do that, now you get Africa as one group, but then Europe, the Middle East, Central and South Asia, that's one group. And then that's the blue. And then the purple, East Asia, Oceania, America, that's the third group. What if you tell the computer there's 4 groups? Well, then what it does is it separates East Asia and Oceania from the American Indians. And by American Indian, I mean they're, for example, Maya group, or the native Colombians. So now if you tell it's k equals 5, what does it do? Oh, Oceania suddenly is its own group. But you can do more. K equals 6. Now there's this strange cluster, the Kalish, who I believe live in Pakistan. So some authors, like Quayshawn Spencer in a 2014 paper, take this data to actually justify the ordinary American conception of race. He calls this K equals 5 partition, calls it the Blumenbach partition. Blumenbach was a German anthropologist writing a long time ago, 1795, who came up with these, he said there's 5 races, 5 different groups of people. He called them Ethiopian, Caucasian, Mongolian, American, and Malayan. American there is American Indian, Native American. Guess what? Actually, now it's not like Blumenbach had seen everybody on Earth, but that's arguably exactly the same partition that Rosenberg and his colleagues came up with if you assume that there's 5. So for hundreds of years, and the US Census has basically those categories. So for hundreds of years, at least some authors have thought, this is the natural grouping, and it turns out now this seems to be justified. There's at least some evidence that those are genetic clusters. Okay, so does that mean that there are races? Well, that leads us to this question of what biological realism actually requires. Appiah would say no. Appiah assumes that race builds in to it, the very concept of race, builds in that people of different races actually differ in very important and essential ways. That to say you're, a Black African is to say you have traits X, Y, Z. To say you're an American Indian is to say you have traits A, B, C. Now, we know now that that's not true. That is, populations might have trait frequencies. So maybe American Indians tend to have a certain blood type at higher levels or lower levels, but it's not going to be 100% anything of basically any important trait. There are no fixed unique traits. In fact, clades above the species are identified or defined by these unique traits, the shared derived characteristics, so-called synapomorphies. So I say things like primates have opposable thumbs, or mammals have hair. I can do that, or tetrapods have the 4-limb structure. Bony fish. So these are all groups that humans are in. Bony fish, the osteoichthyes, they have bones, right? Vertebrates, chordates. That's those, humans, it goes from Homo sapiens to hominids to primate, or I guess simian first, then primate. So there's all these groups, and every one of those groups have these unique, essential defining traits. Mammals, all and only organisms that have hair are mammals. All and only organisms that have feathers are birds. You can't do that below the species level. Cladistics doesn't work below the species level. That would be a biological criticism. But on the other hand, we do know enough to know that there are just frequency differences between groups. So on average, just like, for example, there's differences between men and women with respect to, say, height, It doesn't mean that every man is taller than every woman. Similarly, there just are genetic differences between these groups, like between the clustering groups. That's why you can pick out where they're from. Where I pick an individual, I can say where their ancestry is from if I know their genome, because there are these differences. But now, are they big differences? Are they important differences, or are they kind of trivial traits? Well, here, what do you mean? How big is big? How important is important? I suspect that even once you fix that, the answer is, for mostly, we don't really know. For example, you might think important differences would be kind of behavioral differences. For example, are there heritable IQ differences between groups? Well, we don't really know. The genetic underpinnings of behavior is very controversial. We don't really, set aside race. This entire field is scientifically controversial and unclear. So throw race in there, it's not like now right? So we just don't know about the genetic links between various kinds of traits. There's very few traits, maybe certain diseases, we have pretty good ideas of the genetic underpinnings. But for most, mental or psychological traits, we don't really understand the genetics. So why would we think that we'd understand how that correlates with race? Now, there's other kinds of criticisms you can make of the clustering approach that I just want to mention before we end. So first of all, this idea that it justifies the ordinary conception. Well, just like the cladistic concept, there's no set number of natural groups. If you tell the computer to find 5 groups, it will find 5 groups. But you could tell the computer to find 20, it will find 20. Tell the computer to find 9, it will find 9. There's nothing natural about 5. There's just a groups within groups structure. Also, the genetic differences are graded. They vary more or less continuously over space. So if I say African is a group, well, sub-Saharan African is different than Central African, is different than North African. There's a kind of continuous variation, just like there is with, say, skin color. There's going to be with basically any genetic frequency. So even if, European is one cluster, there's going to be differences between the Mediterranean, Southern Europe versus far Northern Europe versus, Eastern Europe. Those are different. And they're not, Eastern Europe isn't one thing. Very far Eastern Europe is different than kind of Central Eastern Europe is different. These things kind of vary continuously across space and time. So the natural, the distinction at the higher than the species level, it's not like that, right? There are, the species boundaries, even though there's some hybridization, but the whole point is that there are these chunks. But that's not true of human genetic groups. So what does that mean for race? Well, here's some possible conclusions once you see this data. And the data is unclear. We're still studying it. Geneticists are still learning and they're building new trees, etc. But imagine you knew it all. Now what? Well, you could conclude that race is biologically real. That we've discovered the biological basis of race. And so if we have misconceptions like about which groups go with which other groups, or about whether there's essential traits or about the differences between races, we should just fix those misconceptions. We're correcting our common sense notions. But you could think, no, it just differs too much from what we assumed. You don't correct your common sense notion. You instead decide that there is no biological underpinning for race. That's also possible. In my interview with Robin Andreasen, she suggested actually a third kind of view, which is some kind of pluralism. Maybe there's a scientific conception, which is going to be a cladistic conception, she would argue. You might prefer genetic clustering. But maybe there's just also a social conception. Maybe on that social conception, Hispanic is a race, for example. But it's not a genetic group. So, but they're going to be related, surely. I mean, the way we socially group people into races is related to ancestry. It's certainly related to, for example, how people look physically. So that's going to be related to genetics and ancestry. But what if they're not the same? Well, view 1 says, well, the biological one is real, so pitch the social one. View 2 says, well, the social one is real. The biological one's not doing what we need. View 3 here is that there's some kind of pluralism. Maybe somehow both exist. So I'm going to stop here and say that's kind of a, like all interesting topics, we're leaving it with questions. Now what? What do you do? Well, it's hard.